All right, thank you everybody. My name is Kendra Jo Grindle. I am the Maine Connectivity Authority's Community Capacity Manager, which basically means all communities all the time. So I support our organization by bringing a community voice and lens to all of our programming, as well as supporting our Get Ready Community Support program. And supporting delivering community resources and capacity engagement across the state. I am accompanied by Megan Grable, who I'll let introduce herself.
Yes, I am the Geospatial Data Analyst for Maine Connectivity Authority. So I work with maps and data and do spatial analysis for the authority. But you'll kind of get to hear more about what I do as we go through the slides, the big burning questions that keep me up at night.
So we're going to talk about a few things today across data collection and challenges. There are some rabbit holes that we aren't going to dig into, and I'll try to steer, especially around questions and answers, I'll try to steer our conversation towards the focus today around data collection and specifically the FCC challenge. But just a quick show of hands. Has anyone in the room challenged either their location or the availability of their address using the FCC map? Awesome, awesome. Did anyone get to the checkbox where it said send it to your ISP and chicken out? Me. Okay, so that's great. I love to see that already in the room we have some people who are going to know what Megan's talking about a little bit. For those that didn't raise your hand, you might leave here with a to-do tonight, some homework, which is also really exciting, not just for me, but definitely for Megan. So with that, I'm going to let Megan kick off. I am going to say that if you have a question, because we're talking about something that's around data and mapping, and you're probably going to have a question about something that's on a slide, please feel free to raise your hand. So if someone has mics, just know that we're going, shouting to you in the back there, Clara. Just know that we're going to allow questions throughout this. I won't let us get too hung up on one slide for too long. But if something does come up while Megan's talking, feel free to raise your hand. We'll get you a mic and get your question asked in a timely manner that has to do with what she's talking about on the slide. Sound good? All right.
All right, so why are we doing all of this data collection? What does it mean? What implications does it have for the state of Maine, for communities individually? And there's lots of minor reasons, or maybe smaller reasons, depending on your position. But there's two big reasons right now that are of great importance to the state of Maine. And the first one is for the BEAD allocation. So we've heard a bit about the BEAD funding that's coming to the state of Maine. This allocation formula is based in large part upon the number of unserved locations that we have in the state. It's estimated that as we add an unserved location to the total counts, we're increasing the amount of funding coming to the state of Maine by $4,200. This number decreases slightly as we add more and more points, but the overall number in total keeps increasing as we add points. So the more unserved points Maine can identify, the better. And these unserved points come from this data collection effort and from the challenge process. The other reason why we're trying to move towards having more accurate broadband mapping is that we're going to be using all of this data to determine the best way to make sure everyone in the state of Maine who wants a connection can get one. So this is another little pet project. It's bigger than that. This is a project we've been working on for a while to be able to show what the state of broadband is in Maine. This is based off of the recently made available FCC broadband data collection data. We can download it and then process it in order to come up with the locations of places that are meeting our different service tiers based on the classification. So those that are under 25.3 we consider least served. Then we have the underserved category, 120 to 100 over 100, and we have our fully served at 100 over 100 over 100. So this is just a static version of this map, but I recommend you go to our website later today. It's on the front page. Scroll down a little bit, and you can go in and you can zoom, and you can see what the FCC data says about your census block right now. There are also a couple other tabs on this interactive map. We have the funding awards. So right now we have the past Connect Maine awards that have been given out. As you zoom around the map, it will show you the different extent and calculate the amount of money awarded and the number of projects and then potential subscribers that were identified in those applications. As we continue to hand out money and connect more people, we'll be adding to the map. And so eventually, someday, we will have the entire map hopefully highlighted with everyone connected.
So Megan, just looking at what we're currently, you have the whole state here. So down in connectivity comparison, we're looking at 100% of the state, and we're seeing 18% on unserved, 67% underserved, 15% served. And as you zoom in to your region, so if I were to zoom into kind of the Knox County, Lincoln County area in which I live, how is that going to change those comparisons?
So the statewide view will stay the same to give you the comparison to the state. And then the current view bar is going to adjust depending on the census blocks that are in your extent. So it will constantly be recalculating as you're moving around to give you the percent of unserved, underserved, and served in each of those areas.
Great. We do have one question with Michael Porter down the front, and then how did I know where those questions were going to come from first?
Okay, sorry about that, Kendra. But
No, you're fine.
the business of going into the website, zoom in, you find yourself as a little dot.
You will not find yourself as a little dot on
You
this map.
you do on the FCC map.
Correct.
And
We'll
you challenge.
get there. We're going there.
Okay, you challenge that.
Yep.
Okay, but that's sort of a retail process. I can give you in one swell swoop 500 unserved, 500 addresses that the FCC says are served and that I know are unserved, and Connect Maine is accepted as unserved. Is there a process for that?
We would be interested in looking at the data that you have and having a conversation with you about why the discrepancy with the FCC maps.
I think the discrepancy with the FCC maps provider information and the fact they include satellites available.
Oh, okay.
But also, my information was also submitted to Vetro as part of the process of applying for the last round of Connect Maine grants. So do you now have access to the Vetro information as far as challenging the
Yes, I do have access to the Vetro information, and this map does not include satellite or fixed wireless. This is based on cable, copper, and fiber. I was going to say DSL. I was like, no, I already said that one. So there's different ways in the FCC website to kind of filter your data so that you are only looking at the things that apply to the particular funding program that you're looking at. In BEAD, licensed fixed wireless is included in the calculation, but satellite is not. And so we have all these differences of definitions of what counts as served and doesn't based on technology and speed. That does get a little confusing, but in this map, those points should not show up as served. They should show up in one of the other categories.
Yeah, so I think a really good, just to kind of sum up what you said, when we look at this map, and we're going to get to the FCC map and why it's a little bit different and what it's showing, especially for Mainers who've been active in broadband, and how that looks different than the conversations we've been having over the last few years. But when we look at this map, it really is based around what the state of Maine has defined as served, unserved, and underserved, and least served, and where we are in terms of our state goals based on our state definitions and what we have here. So we're going to do Charlie's question, and then we're going to move forward.
Yeah, I think you probably just answered it in the last 10 seconds. That
I love it.
These numbers here that you're talking, the unserved, underserved, those reflect the Maine state definition, not necessarily the federal definitions.
Yes.
Correct? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking as a state agency and, we're talking about the goals, it's based on the definitions that we have. We recognize that the funding sources that are coming from the federal government have different definitions. We're going to have to adapt and adjust for those, but we're tracking our goals based on the definitions that were set forth by the Connect Maine Authority.
And always the underlying data, we know the maximum speeds, the technologies, and so when we aggregate it like this for people to be able to interact with more easily, that doesn't mean that we don't still have a way to process to look at it differently.
Awesome.
So, in the past, the ISPs submitted data based on Form 477, which was aggregated at the census block level. And I think probably more people in this room could explain this better than I could, but this is an example of a couple of different polygons, a couple of different census blocks that are colored green and therefore served by this symbology. And you can see along the roads in between the census blocks that we have points that showed up in the BDC data as much lower service availability, so unserved or least served. In the old way of counting these points, we would not have any of these pink ones over here, would not show up as unserved. They would be counted in the served classification because it was 1 point in that census block was what the entire census block and all of the points in it were counted as. So the FCC has moved towards a more granular form of reporting, and we can sit here all day and talk about all of the flaws that are apparent with it, but the goal has been to move to a more accurate reflection of broadband mapping, and this is a huge step forward for the nation in being able to understand at the level that we need to of who's served and who isn't served. So for Form 77 compared to BDC, when we're looking at the unserved allocations for the BEAD,
Can you just explain BDC?
BDC is the broadband data collection effort put on by the Federal Communications Commission. And I'll go a little deeper into what the different parts of that are. I think next slide maybe. But so in that last map, where we took all of the points, counted all of the points, if we counted all of those points in the green areas as served in Form 477, we ended up with only 17,652 points. If then now we have the BDC information where the ISPs have overlaid their data and we count all of the unserved locations, now we have 32,000 points. So it's a big change, and it was about what they expected. They expected it to about double when we went granular like this. So to make this national broadband map, there's really two parts to it. The first part is the thing that's the fabric. These are all broadband serviceable locations in the nation. A company called CostQuest was in charge of making all of these points and making it available to the FCC. The points have some nuances to them. One being that they have to be broadband serviceable for mass market subscription. So we leave out the community anchor institutions or those that would have like an enterprise network. And another common question with these points are on the multi-dwelling units. So a single point on a structure is pretty easy to figure out when you have a bunch of single-family housing. But in multifamily housing, there's been a lot of questions 1 point per structure with a multi-dwelling unit count that indicates the number of individual subscribers that would be associated with that point, except for in situations where you have townhouses that are technically a single structure, but are set on separate parcels, and then they should be counted each as an individual point. So nothing like making it more confusing, something that was already a complicated problem to try to figure out. So we end up with all of these points. Maine, it has around 658,000 of them right now. And on top of those points, they asked all of the internet service providers to indicate the things that they had specified in the past for Form 477, so your technology code, the maximum advertised upload and download speeds at all of those locations. And then that all was due September 1st. They compiled all of this information, and on November 18th, you could log on to the FCC map and check out your house. We can download the data. If you have access to the BSLF, you can join it to the points. And if you don't have access to that, there's Hex 3 polygons that were created by Uber that you can join it to and get some understanding of what the map would look like for a bigger 1 kilometer hexes. So the next step in the process in order to improve what broadband mapping looks like is the challenge process. And this is what we are in right now. The first challenge process is challenging the broadband fabric itself. And those of you who deal with mapping and have seen the VSLF or those of internet service providers know that it was, what did I hear somebody say? We were lowering expectations on how accurate the BSLF was. And so, yes.
Accuracy in the sense of the service availability, or accuracy on both service availability and you said 658 serviceable locations. Are we taking that as also being accurate, or
So
lowering
that's
expectations?
the BSLF, the fabric, is only about the locations, and it's only about the points. Later, ISPs had to file on top of each of those locations, but you can see how it's difficult to properly assign service availability when your underlying locations are not great. So here's some examples of kind of the struggle that CostQuest was up against in order to be able to determine for the nation where all of the points should land. So in this first picture here, we have 2 structures which, based on the color of the roofs, I'm going to guess that they are a single parcel, so a single family house with probably a barn. The guidance would be that a single point should be put onto the house and there should not be a point on the barn. However, if you run a business out of your barn, or you have some other reason why you would want 2 sets of broadband service brought separately to these locations, this second point could be identified as a broadband serviceable location. But that would mean that you would want to subscribe twice and not use some sort of like repeating technology from the house out to your barn. If we go to the next picture in kind of this subdivision, probably Millinocket by Katahdin, you can see that there's a vacant lot. Maybe somebody absorbed a house that had disappeared down here by this red car. And so when they were doing like the methodology for trying to figure out how do we programmatically find all these points, they were using parcel data. And they used aerial imagery some, but you can't look over the entire United States manually to be able to identify. So we'll see where points are on places where there isn't a house now. And a known error that CostQuest has called out is when new construction has happened. Generally, that entire subdivision, if it happened after a certain date, all of those points are missing. And then it just gets more complicated as we go into something even more mixed use, like the third picture of trying to identify how many different structures there are. The data that I've seen for the state of Maine, there is a lot of missing points out around our lakes of places where you can see kind of the camps through the trees. And there's definitely some docks out in the water that indicate that there is something there, yet there are 0 points on that lake as if it's a desolate lake. And someone I was talking with had hypothesized that this was, they had grabbed a water layer that was 5 or 10 feet bigger, or they had buffered it too large for Maine, accidentally grabbed those points and wiped them out of the calculation. So there's things, there's patterns that we can see for trying to identify some of these points, but it's not an easy undertaking for us to automate and fix either. So the next type of challenge is also something that the state can do as a bulk challenge. The governmental entities who have the authority for broadband in the state are given this ability to challenge a large swath of either location points or service availability points. And so this one is one that's a little trickier to do. We sent some teams out into the field to do some field validation where they would go and look and make sure that the technology that was stated, if it was cable or fiber, was that actually what was hanging on the poles at these points. And if it wasn't there, then that point got flagged for further investigation and as a point that we would be challenging. This shouldn't be taken as they use the word challenge, and it's very combative sounding, and I don't think it needs to be, because as hard as it is to identify all of the locations, it's also very hard then to add all these different layers of data on top of it. And so it's a complicated problem for all of the stakeholders involved. So then we get to the individual challenge process. It's a very unfortunate spot that line landed. Yep. Very sorry about that. It should be down a little bit. So in the individual challenge process, this is where consumers can go to the FCC map, and you can challenge either your location or the availability that's claimed at your location on a provider-by-provider basis. We have launched a campaign to correct the dots, and we are encouraging Mainers anywhere and everywhere to go and check your location in the FCC broadband maps and see if it's right. Is your point missing? Then we need to get your point added, especially if you're a point that's in an unserved location. Because remember the beginning, we want to get as many unserved points as possible. So you can go to this web page. I'm pretty sure these slides are being shared, but you could find it pretty easily on our website for just more information for how to get the word out, some different tools to help you talk with your community, and some instruction on how to do it. The FCC has all sorts of social media support, TikTok and Instagram, and on their regular website for how to walk through it, and MCA is also here to support if anyone has a problem navigating the website. And so why don't we, Christine? So my friend Christine Parker is helping us out here driving the show. So this is the website that you would land on if you went to broadbandmap.fcc.gov. So does anybody want to volunteer their address, or should we just pick a random we got a volunteer?
Volunteer.
Oh.
At 112
112
Bernard Road.
Bernard.
B-E-R
B-E-R.
N-A-R-D
N-A-R-D.
B as in boy. Yep.
And in Bernard,
it-
Maine? Oh,
Bernard Road.
yes.
There we are.
All right.
So you want to walk us through what we should be seeing here?
So we are looking at all of the points. They're all green, and there's a map legend on the right. If we scroll down the bar a little bit, green indicates that there is coverage. However, one of the things that we asked...
Can we take one step back and talk about, so it's showing served, right? But this is as the federal definitions,
Right.
right? Not the state of Maine definitions.
So this is, you're right, the speed of 25.3 or greater, and you can see it's all, and it's any technology. So if we go to that little cog, you can filter on some of the different definitions so that you can see the things that you want to see. All right, so we're gonna look at wired in the 100/20 or greater category. So now we have some red points that are showing up. No ISPs claim to offer that level of speed at those locations, but the green ones still indicate that there's 100/20 happening at those points. So this looks like it's Charter Communications is the main one causing these to show up as served at that service level. 1 gig, yep, and 1 gig,
And
1 gig down and 1 gig up, or 35 up.
35. Easy
Correct.
now.
Let's not get excited.
So I guess the question back is that accurate? And this is where you could start to enter a challenge.
Yes, I have Spectrum.
You have Spectrum? Okay, great. Sure.
13 South Road, Shebig Island.
So 13 South Road, Shebig. That second one there.
Yeah, C-H-E, oh,
There
you
you-
got it.
Yep, we got it.
Okay, that-
Depending on how you look at this, David could either be really excited or really sad, right?
well, the good news is they're there, they're just not fast enough. Yeah. 10 or 20 or greater.
Yeah, not,
Where the dot is, where my house is, it's actually 6.
Yeah, so that's the other question, right? I mean, the 1 gig, that's what Spectrum says, though, that they're gonna keep, that's the promise.
Advertised speed.
Exactly.
Yep.
So if you run a speed test and you take a JPEG of it, can you drop that in to show that your actual speed that you're getting is not what they
the FCC is not dealing with that challenge right now. They are only focused on what the service provider offers for the speed. Yeah, and they are allowing, there is a separate challenge-ish process that we haven't talked about here, where the state authority can submit crowdsourced data. So all of those speed tests that we took in the state of Maine are great information that we will be submitting to the FCC. In doing the crowdsourced submission, those do not require response from ISPs, but the information is going to be generally used in the process by the FCC when discrepancies come up.
Well, I do have a question here. Axiom Technologies, 10 down, 1 up, I think that's quite accurate, but the legend would indicate, as you pointed out earlier, 10/20. And
Nope, because it says
100
not available at that 100/20, and these dots are all red,
oh, I see, okay, thank
you're
you.
not covered at that filtering.
So does anyone have a new build by chance where we could look at maybe a location of a newer build?
Or maybe in Litchfield, where we were looking earlier.
Do you want a new build?
Give me just a moment. I think we're gonna, sure. Do we have a new build?
To pull up Fry Island, Maine.
Fry.
Fry
Island,
Island.
Frye, Island, Maine.
We'll go, any address?
The data's there
Okay.
with the inaccuracies from the underlying fabric.
So let's turn on the aerial imagery. This is I love doing this. So now we can zoom in a little bit and try to find where there might be a problem. And let's see, do you see any, Christine, right away?
So this is Fry Island, right? So Andrew,
Yep.
as the ISP and someone who lives on Fry Island.
So on this area, there's a lot of fabric
there's one.
errors, which is actually my question is, how are you guys gonna handle bulk fabric data errors? If you zoom out, any red dots you see along the outside of the island are actually fabric errors that are coded as Raymond, not Fry Island, in the same zip code.
So
And we didn't have a process during the earlier part, we couldn't, as an ISP, we could not challenge the fabric
You
in a
could not.
bulk manner.
to get rid of
But
the.
you can.
Yes. So we are actively working with Vetro to verify the locations because we all want the locations to be accurate. And so these points, we can challenge those, and we will challenge those as part of the bulk challenge process.
So you want ISPs give you bulk fabric data sets? Is there gonna be a process announced for that? Like, because it could be a lot of data.
Yes, and I believe the ISPs can also now challenge the fabric data themselves.
I believe it's single data point by single data point.
You can't file a bulk?
I don't think so.
Okay,
Glad to
we
talk
will
offline.
double check on that and get you the information on that. Because if our ISPs can't file in bulk, then yes, that seems like it would be very difficult for you. Yeah.
I feel like it's a little hard to tell what might be a roof and what might be just poor.
I think though
imagery.
this one definitely, because we could see the road coming in there. So this is a point where we have missed a location. And so if you were the homeowner here, you could click on this rooftop and then challenge location. And then you can go in and fill out all the information so that this point gets added and that your house now counts towards the totals for Maine.
You want a challenge? I got one here. You want to look up an address?
Sure.
320 Aroostook Falls Road. You might guess where that might be, right?
Just
Too
one
many
R.
R's,
Just one R.
no I's.
STOO.
Yep. The third one down there in Fort Fairfield.
That's it.
Perfect.
So if you zoom out a little bit, you'll see, and I know this because I just moved away from this address, and I pleaded with the provider that had 25.3 supposedly, the fixed wireless, and they said, we absolutely can't, even though the guy across the road from me had it. He said, no, we don't get you and the folks toward Canada from you. So
So instead of a location challenge, we're talking about an accessibility challenge on this one.
Availability.
Oh, sorry, availability. So
Right,
there is a home there, but it's saying that you have a service that you don't have, and you've been told by a provider that you can't
Right.
have.
And that's what the problem is with the fixed wireless stuff. It's line of sight, a lot of it, and half the road doesn't get covered, and all of a sudden they just say, paint it all one way.
So in this one, as the consumer, what you would do is click on that availability challenge, and since you've had the conversation with the provider, it asks you for your proof, but really, that you've had this conversation and that you were advised that you couldn't have it. And so then that will be submitted, and the ISP will have to respond to it. And we have heard, not from any ISPs in Maine yet, but from some of our partner states, that ISPs have already responded to some of these challenges and found the data that they submitted to the FCC was incorrect in a couple of locations and went and fixed that. And I'm sure that the opposite has happened as well.
So when that happens, Megan, does the consumer or resident that submitted their challenge, do they get a response or a notice that it's been
They
fixed?
do. They do. There was also a bit of a bug for a minute on the FCC website where if you challenged every time you went back to it, it would keep like reminding you about this this challenge that you had started. But yes, when I challenged my location, I got an email that it had been processed. Throughout the process of the ISP, moving through your challenge as a consumer, you will be updated as it moves along. So if it's accepted as is, then you'll get that notification. If the ISP contests your challenge, then there's a process for that to move through. It can go for up to 120 days, I believe, from the day that you submit the challenge until it lands at the FCC for them to adjudicate a decision on it.
Just gonna go one more question here in the front, and then we'll move forward. Just kidding. We'll go 1.5 more questions here in the front.
Thank you. So I'm a library director in a small library.
Yes, right.
And so I'm wondering, in terms of helping people who do not in fact have internet or may not have a phone or an email, do you have any recommendations for the best ways for us to help people with their challenges? Because these are people that we definitely want to make sure are being put on the map.
Yes, and this should definitely be part of the community outreach that is done, the supports that we provide through the different groups like libraries. We are using our speed test data also, where people were able to go and put in an address and say, I don't have service here. So we have that information that we'll be using to get those points added to the map. So any way possible to get people who don't have access, right, into this process, yeah, and we will employ all methods and use the systems already set up. The other little thing that I forgot to mention is that for the challenges to be included in the bead allocation, we have to have this done by January 13th, which, is eons away. So we have this like really short crunch push where we're trying to do as much as we can as quickly as we can. And after that, we still have time to do all of the correcting and improving of the data, especially when we're thinking about the other purposes for the data. But this January 13th deadline is like a very, very big deadline to make sure that you get as much effort as quickly as possible into this before then.
I'm gonna let Andrew ask a question, and then we are gonna move on.
One quick comment and then a question while folks get their eyes on this on the website as well. To an earlier question, ISPs can facilitate bulk challenges and can forward more info on that. I think helpful to just get a sense, what are the implications of successful challenges? So if we are successful, what are the potential implications of that with any particular challenge point?
If we challenge a single point and we get it added to the map, if it's an unserved location, we are looking at an additional $4,200 per point, which is a lot of money, especially once you start adding them up. We've been kind of running and crunching the numbers because it isn't just like a hard, you add a point and you automatically get that much more money. It is based on a little bit more complicated of an equation where we also are being compared proportionally to the points in the rest of the nation and how many of their points are unserved as well. I think Maine is in a pretty good position, being such a small state, of having so few points that it takes us fewer, 2,000 points here is a lot. In Texas, it's, 2,000 points is nothing. So Granted, they have more to go after, but getting 2,000 people is still getting 2,000 people to participate.
Yeah, and so with with this, we started with our map, our kind of heat map of the state and our definitions and where that data came from. As those challenges happen, will that map be updated? How often are we going to be updating maps? If you go in and you challenge and it gets accepted, how quickly could that potentially impact your community or your internet service provider in seeking funds for your area?
So, two things, two lines of thought there. First, the FCC updates the maps every 6 months. So every 6 months, the ISPs file on the data. The challenge process is ongoing. Location challenges are ongoing, but as they will publish the map every 6 months, and so we're tracking that. And so things like the heat map that we showed in the beginning, that'll get updated every 6 months with that data. The knowing that our data tends to be a little bit ahead because it doesn't need to go through submission to the FCC and then acceptance and then published into their map. This allows us to use the data that's based on our local knowledge and our decision making in key ways. So that we reserve that to have kind of a Maine broadband map that we believe to be the most accurate for making decisions.
Great. You've said before that there's been some field validation that MCA has done. Is there any thought to doing more of that, especially if communities maybe point out that they're maybe not every resident can do something, but there looks to be in this one community or this area some inaccuracies. Is there any thought to MCA sending out more field validation?
Yes, but not by January 13th.
Yep. What is time, really, right?
We have the field validation teams here pretty regularly anyway to check up on grants that have been awarded. And so it often makes sense to just have that, they're here, and have them drive around a little bit longer and look at a couple more things. It's a fascinating job if anyone ever gets to ride along with one of those technicians.
Any last questions burning? Right down here in the front.
My name is Pam. I'm with First Light. I'm an ISP.
Welcome.
And that's really cool. Can I copy and paste that as a bill message or a bill insert?
Yes, please.
I can? Okay.
We love to see it. Yeah, so, that's a little bit of the call to action here. We've asked it before when it came to speed testing. We're asking it now when it comes to this, right? One of the amazing things about Maine is the power of community and the power of the individual. And so when you're talking to communities, I know that I often hear well, what can I do to help, right, as an individual? And before it was, well, you could take the speed test on the Maine Broadband Coalition website, which you still should do. But also, this is something that every Mainer could go in and do. And you can just check your address, right? You can check your neighbor's address or your mom's address or your child's address, whatever that looks like, and start that conversation. And maybe they go in and everything's fine. And maybe they go in and see hey, it says, I know for my location, I already knew this, but it said I had a fiber connection with an ISP that I know that I don't have. I could have been pleasantly surprised and then called up that internet service provider and said, hey, it says I have fiber. Can I get that? They would have said no, which means I get to challenge that availability. But for some, I know that I get phone calls and emails of new residents who don't even know what they possibly have access to, and this starts to give you a little insight. But it can also start those conversations of, well, I called, they said no. They can't get me connected in 10 days. Is that what it is?
10 business days for a reasonable cost.
10 business days for a reasonable cost. And we will leave it to someone else to decide what reasonable cost is.
They gave guidance on that.
Perfect. But, I think leaving this room, I asked in the beginning how many people had been to the FCC website and had already looked and or challenged location or availability. I ask of everyone in this room now, unfortunately we have some people coming in, your homework is to go and check this map and put in your address and check your location, check your availability, and then tell somebody else about it. And if you're a broadband committee member, however you communicate to your community, whether that's social media, newsletters, emails, select board meetings, et cetera, we have tools that you can print out and use, and simply put, directing them to this website as a first step. That's an amazing action item that can come out of your time that you've been in the session and been at this broadband summit today. And hopefully we can start to see some more challenges and create more work for Megan. Yeah? Oh, yeah. And if you're an ISP, I really appreciate the idea of sticking that in a billing package, right? Like, it's a partnership, and it takes a village, and we all want more accurate data, and that comes from each of us as individuals, and it comes from our partners in this room. So, awesome. There you go. Thanks. I love it.